Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. With me, as always, Executive Editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior Editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Washington Commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, commentary contributor, author of several books, contributor at National Review, and the chairman of the Bahnsen Group, David Bahnsen. Welcome back, David.
Well, thank you, John. Always a pleasure.
So we have second quarter GDP numbers just out. Pretty good. 3%. I mean, it's not 10%. It's not 20%. It's not 4%, but it is 3%. And this actually, I think, brings us to one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you today, David. Obviously, there has been a lot of talk in the last 3 or 4 days about the Trump deal with the European Union for a tariff and the tariff regime generally that has been moving forward. And I think a lot of people were assuming that there would be economic chaos and collapse and nightmarish immediate consequences from Trump's pursuit of the tariffs. But the data suggest that is not happening. And I would like, as I think all of us, having been educated in the history of tariffs and the nature of tariffs and the fact that tariffs function effectively as a tax, not on people in Europe who are manufacturing goods, but on the Americans here who are purchasing goods that are subject to the tariffs. What do you make of the fact that the consequences are not yet being felt, or that MAGA people and others will say, see, it turns out all these things you've been told about tariffs are wrong and they're just fantastic and everything's going to be great and our manufacturing sector will be reborn and everybody in the world will benefit?
Well, there are two things I'm certain of in this environment in which we find ourselves. One is that the left would use any negative data disingenuously. And number two is that MAGA will use any positive data disingenuously. So I remain friendless in this 10-year and counting period where I am desperately clinging to objectivity and honesty. I think it's not so much, John, explaining why things are good in the aftermath of the tariff element, but rather resetting the actual premises. 3%, anytime you get a quarterly GDP number, people need to remember that that number has been annualized for you. So they are not giving you a quarterly number that you then get to multiply by 4. It has already been multiplied by 4. And so on an annualized basis, the number came in at 3% for this quarter. It was negative 0.5% last quarter. So far on an annualized basis, we are tracking in 2025 for 1.25% real GDP growth. That's atrocious. However, it will go higher. We will avoid a recession, not because the tariffs are proven to be good, but because the tariffs as threatened on April 2nd, 2025, which would have represented 400 billion best case and 600 billion worst case in the fiscal year of 2025, did not happen. So those that are now saying, see, all the experts were wrong, are playing a game of switcheroo. People making predictions about if something happened, something doesn't happen, then saying, see, you were wrong, is rather elementary dishonesty. Now, here's the thing on the other side of it, though, for a tariff skeptic and critic like me. I think that both sides have said things for which they will be held to account, and not in one quarter and not even necessarily in 1 year. I think about a year or longer. Those who said all of these American manufacturing jobs are coming back. Well, I guess we're going to get a chance to see. And if anyone's interested in taking the other side of that bet with me, I'll put up real money up front and give you really good odds if anyone actually wants to back up the political hyperbole with an economic bet that these manufacturing jobs are coming back. those that have said we are cutting out trade, that we will no longer be buying from foreign countries. I'd be very happy to objectively analyze that forecast. But on the anti-tariff side, I think you're going to get, John, in about a year, a chance to very objectively say, here's where things went better than expected, here's where things went worse. If total trade declines and capital flows into the US decline accordingly, then there is no scenario algebraically by which it doesn't contract from GDP. People can say, well, what's going to happen is the trade deficit isn't going to be down much. And people say, well, Trump never really meant that. It was hyperbole. The fiscal deficit's obviously not going to be down. And people say he never really meant that. It was hyperbole. So I can't argue against stuff that people get to take back whenever they want. But I do believe that there is a question as to the way in which this has gone since April 3rd, in the aftermath of April 2nd, Liberation Day. We're susceptible to a lot of unknowns. A 25% universal tariff on European imports would have been much different than what they ended up doing, where now you get a 15% tariff baseline with a ton of 0%. So where that nets out in the end, we don't have a deal with India yet. We don't have a deal with Brazil yet, but we're getting to a deal with South Korea and Taiwan. We have a deal with Vietnam and UK and Japan, and then parts of a deal are understood with China. The biggest difference, John, is that all the threats with China didn't happen. And in fact, the rhetoric substantially changed. And I say that gratefully. I'm not, talking the administration here. Secretary Besson's done a wonderful job. Instead of saying what we need to do is get to a point of total decoupling from our largest trading partner, we want different terms and different markets opened up. I'm skeptical about Japan buying Ford F-150s, and I'm skeptical of how much China really can buy from us other than soybeans and liquefied natural gas. But to the extent that we succeed in opening up any markets, that will be a victory for the administration that I'll be the first to say, because of this, we got more markets opened. But again, that leads to more trade. More markets open means more trade. Yeah. And we were told time and time again the issue was less trade for protectionist purposes. So any part of tariff policy that drives more trade I'm for and is bullish. And any part of tariff policy that is protectionist leads to less trade, and therefore I'd be bearish. But ultimately, we have a fiscal deficit that is partially funded by foreigners. The current account deficit in the United States is the inverse of the international current account. And to the degree that those things move in the wrong direction, then it puts pressure on. We have the foreign ownership of U.S. stock has doubled in the last 8 years. Foreign ownership of treasury bonds is significant, of private credit significant. So to the extent there's less capital flows, which has never been a problem for the United States, we have open capital, unlike China, unlike other adversary countries. And of course, we are a desirable place to put capital. Any marginal decline of capital flows is where I would expect you'd see negative impact, and that would take about a year to play out.
I think David raises an interesting point about the evolution of the arguments for Trump's tariffs. I would just break it down this way. Before Trump took office, throughout the campaign last year, he said basically 3 reasons for his trade wars. Tariffs would close the trade gap, the trade deficit. That's number 1. Number 2 would be that tariffs would lead to reindustrialization or onshoring of manufacturing jobs. And the third reason was tariffs would raise revenue. So what are the arguments that we're hearing now that he's been in office for 6 months?
I would add the fourth of national security.
Yeah, the decoupling or de-risking of China. Now we hear that tariffs are opening up markets. We hear that tariffs are leading to more foreign direct investment. That's number 2. And then we hear number 3, tariffs are raising revenues. So what's the common denominator is tariffs are raising revenues, and they're pretty remarkable, the revenues that are coming into the Treasury, as you would expect from any increase in the corporate tax rate, which is essentially what these tariffs are. They're taxes put on businesses that some of the costs will be passed through to the consumers, just like the arguments for lowering the corporate tax were always that the corporate tax is actually passed on through consumers. But I think because these arguments are changing, and the bottom line is that the approach has changed as well, and this revenue piece is important, reinforce the idea that the Trump economic policy can never be viewed in isolation. And so we've spoken about trade, and that's because Trump's obsessed with trade quite a bit. But why does David say that growth may go up at the end of the year and into next year? Well, it's not just the trade or the effects of this tariff wall we're creating of the 10% universal and slightly higher in some cases, and then other sectoral tariffs. It's also because we prevented the tax increase. And we had some pro-growth measures as part of the one big, beautiful bill, not as many as I would like, but they're in there. It's also because the deregulatory agenda. Yesterday, Lee Zeldin, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, announced possibly the largest deregulatory policy ever, because the EPA is revoking its finding from 2009 at the dawn of Obama's new foundation that what you and I exhale is a pollutant, that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. They're taking that back. That has potential massive effects for economic growth and for freeing up businesses. And it's just one of the deregulation efforts. And then there's energy too. So, John, you're muted. So I can't hear you.
Sorry. So, Matt, I just wanted to say that you point out that tariffs function as an increase in the corporate tax, or in other words, eventually they function as a tax increase on Americans, since the corporations will presumably pass through the tax increases to the consumers or whoever is buying their products. So that's the long-term question, I guess, that David is raising. What will be the negative consequences of that tax increase had there not been the tax cut continuation in the one big beautiful bill? What you could have had was the tax hike of the tariffs that was not balanced out against by the continuation of the 2017 tax cuts and whatever else is in the bill that also has a growth element to the economy. Do I have that right?
John, I think you have to take out from this discussion this idea about the extension of the individual tax cuts from 2017, because on a year-over-year basis, which is what we're doing, we're trying to get year-over-year impact. There's no change. You don't get a growth kick from something that didn't happen.
No, I understand.
But isolating this to the pro-growth parts of the big beautiful bill, which is 100% business expensing, R&D expensing, a change in the formula for interest expense. These things are significant, and they're totally offset now by the additional corporate tax burden of the tariffs, depending on exactly where those things land. But what's fascinating about Matt's list, which is a perfect summation of the four things that they had kind of sold us on and then what the rationale is now. You could really put at the top of list number one, Pete Navarro, and you could put at the top of list number two, Scott Bessent.
Yeah.
Because open markets and FDI is a Bessent rationale, and the trade deficit and protectionism is a Navarro rationale. And to the extent that revenue is now being argued as a benefit, it is
revenue
largely
from the tariffs, you mean?
Yeah, it is. This is a brand new vocabulary in conservatism. It is the polar opposite of Jack Kemp vernacular that I was brought up to talk about. It is a cost to the economy.
Yeah.
And on a balance sheet, we have never looked at what American businesses are paying as revenue just because the tax man is receiving it. And so I think that's an important distinction.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, David. And I would just respond by this: is that in the given the fiscal conditions which you described at the top of the show, the administration is using the revenue case to say, well, this is how we can potentially pay for it, and then also maybe with the higher growth, if we get the higher growth down the road, that would be a way to lower the annual deficit.
But that's the part. The second part is the big issue, and primarily, I guess, my point that it isn't going to be evidenced in the middle of all these negotiations.
Right.
It's by definition a forward-looking thing that will be objectively verifiable. But can I just point out on this real GDP growth issue now, all you did is really harm the numbers in Q1 with 500 basis points. So 5%, 4.96% of contraction from GDP annualized from people front-running imports in Q1. And all you did is get all that back in Q2. That's all that the GDP number is an offset of inventories and net exports, exports minus imports. Those two things offset each other. Consumption, which is the primary ingredient in the formula of GDP, and real business investment, which is what supply side people like myself care about, non-residential fixed investment, both were very muted in Q1 and Q2. So we're playing a little game right now of front running on imports, and it's lumpy in the data. And so in Q1, the left could say, look, Trump's starting a recession, and that was disingenuous. And in Q2, people could say, oh, look, all these damn experts are wrong again. That's completely disingenuous. But in a year, does the real growth that we're talking about materialize or not? Well, I'm with Matt. If it does, guess what materializes it? Deregulation, energy policy, the same darn things all of us have been talking about for 50 years.
Can I just one thing on the revenue piece, though, because I as usual, agree with David about the change in conservatism. But there's another change in conservatism that's looming on the horizon in the Senate that I wanted to mention, which is I think it's one thing when you say, okay, we've put these tariffs on, they're raising much more revenue than we expected. And as part of the policy mix, the Trump policy mix, maybe they can contribute to lowering the deficit in 26. However, you have Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri propose just the other day to rebate the tariff. So $600 tax rebates to Americans that he says would be drawn from the tariff revenues. That, I think, is pure redistribution, pure Harry Hopkins tax, spend, elect politics that is even further estranged from conservatism than the idea of talking up revenues to the government. Because I do think you can argue, okay, fine, we're making these, we're getting this money from the corporations. That's one thing. Let's use it to pay down the deficit, which we need to do in order to ensure long-term growth. And here comes Hawley saying, hey, bread and circuses.
This is a very important point because if people remember, the first real government rebate where everybody got a check from the government happened, I believe, either in 2002 and 2003 as a response to the economic shock of 9/11. And all that rebate was an advance on your tax refund.
Right.
That was you were getting your money back from the government, but early.
Yeah.
Rather than after you filed your tax report, and then you get your refund back. It was a very clever kind of bit of sleight of hand just to prime the pump of the economy so that there would be money for consumers to spend with while everybody was still didn't know what the hell was going to be happening with the economy after. And
it also also failed, John. It got no multiplier effect at all.
Right.
But you're exactly right that it was a advance on their own money, and we were at 50% debt to GDP.
Right. So now we're at 100 and what are we at 110%?
We're at 100% of public debt to GDP. We're at 123% of total debt to GDP. But the thing is that the Hawley thing is not serious. First of all, we know that because it came from Hawley. But also it speaks to a philosophical issue that's very important. CBO scored in the bill that there would be this tariff revenue. So to the extent that any refunds were to be given, it would have to be above and beyond the tariff revenue they already scored in the big, beautiful bill. They're not even going to achieve that amount, let
Right.
alone exceed it and give
But it is
refunds.
important. But Matt, I'm glad that Matt brought it up, because it is
Yeah.
important as a sign of this question of where the populist wing of the Republican Party
Yeah.
wants to plant its flag,
Yeah.
and it is not in growth, which is a very important point, because what they're doing essentially, and that's why Matt making the reference of the day, the now completely obscure, except to certain people, reference of the day to Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's sort of amanuensis and alter ego. That to have a nominally or theoretically conservative Republican propose a completely redistributionist check to everybody, here's $600, go to the track, as opposed to, we need to grow our way out of grow our way away from the fiscal cliff, and grow so that our deficit can shrink because of increased tax revenue, and that will create conditions under which American households will get more than $600 per household, as happened, say, in the late 2018, 2019, when there was a positive effect to the Trump tax cut, and sort of the incredible employment numbers shrinking to the 650-year lows, and the first real increase in American wages in 20 years. So that's what you have to hope for, is that not a rising tide will lift all boats, but that economic growth will have all of these different consequences. And here comes Josh Hawley with the Bannon wing, saying, we don't want to get outflanked on the we're helping the poor. So let's put a stake in the heart of the Republican conservative argument that the way to save ourselves from or to build a future over the next generation is to grow, which is why the EPA's decision is so unbelievably important. And maybe we can spend a couple minutes talking about what it
I
is.
think all these topics that you guys are alluding to all at once capture the challenge of a supply side Reaganite assessing Donald Trump. It's very easy for me to assess Hawley and Bannon and the populist wing, because I really have no philosophical common ground. President Trump is far more schizophrenic economically. He is incredibly pro-growth. He would agree with everything you just said. And the tax impulse he has is not as rooted to a Kemp argumentation. He's fond of Laffer-Moore-Kudlow, but I don't think he's studied in it, but he intuitively gets it. Deregulation, the Zeldin EPA issues you're bringing up. This is under President Trump. He deserves that credit. His energy policy. These things, to me, are all pro-growth, and they come from the same mouth that then turns around and utters things like a trade deficit is killing us, which is a horrifically anti-growth thing to say. The inability to recognize the advantage of letting poor countries make things that you buy, and you putting your capital resources and capital investment into higher margin things. That's the pro-growth argument. So much of the trade deficit rhetoric is where I think President Trump undermines his own growth instincts. And this is why I divide it. And I'm being a little unfair to Navarro and a little overly fair to Bessent. But really, you're just sort of talking about an angel and a devil on each of Trump's shoulders, and they're at odds with one another. But thank God that supply side part of Trump is very prevalent.
I think the other thing to say is, you're talking about growth argument and the tariff argument and all of this. And the sad part about this, to me, at least on the right, is that I thought that this was sort of beyond argument. That is to say that we have had 80, 90 years. I mean, it's 90 years since the New Deal. And that we have this massive amount of macroeconomic data to suggest what happens when trade goes in a certain direction, what happens when regulation is imposed. Even regulators acknowledge that regulation has costs on the economy. They just think that those costs are more important, that the benefit that comes from paying those costs are more important to the future of humanity than paying those costs. And maybe there'll be some ancillary benefit to creating new industries like wind and solar or whatever you want to talk about, energy, that there's a way to offset the cost of regulation through innovative approaches. But that's not why you regulate. You regulate because you think something has to be done to save the environment, or to save people from injury, or to save children from whatever. And so I, again, on the right, I thought we had this is why nothing ever ends. It's like, I thought that this had largely been resolved, that it wasn't even a matter for argument, that international trade benefits our economy. We buy things more cheaply that we wouldn't manufacture, and we are able to sell our services and become the reserve currency of the world and have all the benefits of that, and that these things are all very interlocked. And now we have to have this argument all over again. And there are elements within the administration, not just Navarro, but I would say probably, the vice president's office is running a kind of op inside the Trump administration to continue pushing forward a lot of these ideas, simply because they're branded as populist, and because the idea is you can make an argument that you're helping the new Republican coalition of working class people who don't graduate from college and are more Latino and more black and all of that, and that you can appeal to them with kind of goodies. With that, Matt, would you?
Well, I don't know. I don't think the administration has taken a stand on Hawley's proposal, and I know that most of the Republican senators kind of just batted it down yesterday. I do think we're seeing a broader...
But Matt, isn't it true, though, that they flirted with it previously with the Doge dividend?
Yes, there was a Doge dividend that they were thinking about, but then that
which was equally redistributionist.
Same thing. It's like, no, the whole point of this should be to reduce the deficit, to reduce spending. And so I think I think people like Russ Vought, the head of OMB, kind of plays to Trump's, instincts to cut waste, to cut spending. Where I'm seeing some of the economic discussion play out is recently on antitrust. And so part of this kind of populist reimagination of conservative or Republican economic policy, yes, it involved trade, but it also has involved approaches to economic concentration and to mergers. And there's a fight going on inside the Justice Department right now over Trump's antitrust policy, over how open we're going to be to corporate mergers. And Gail Slater, who was the head of that division, is the attorney. She'd been more inclined toward the J.D. Vance position. J.D. Vance, very critical of corporate power as part of this new republicanism. But it seems that she is now often at odds, or occasionally even overruled by her superiors, like Attorney General Pam Bondi, who represent the kind of more traditional Republican view of things. And this is leading to great furor over in some populist corners. So I think the takeaway is none of this is settled. It's not worked out, and it probably won't ever be, because the Republican Party is this kind of large and unwieldy coalition that doesn't have the consensus that you were talking about, John, any longer.
I think that indications of this administration, and what I know of Kevin Hassett at NEC, and what we can logically induce from Secretary Bessent, and the way in which financial markets are discounting this M&A and expectations for a more lax approach to antitrust, allowing more corporate activity and mergers, is that it is not really philosophical about antitrust for President Trump, that he's generally laissez-faire and pro-market, unless you upset him.
Unless you get annoyed, he gets annoyed.
And so
Yeah.
his first term seemingly antitrust instinct was really more about big tech and them not being nice to him, and the CBS issue with Ellison, the Paramount purchase was more. Are they going to make right on this other issue? And then they added in this DEI stuff and everything, which I'm uncomfortable with. But I don't think President Trump is a Vanceite on M&A, and I think financial markets are expecting a robust amount of activity in corporate activity, both large cap and downstream private equity in the second half of the year.
So on this and all the other issues we talk about on the podcast, there's Trump, and then there's the MAGA populists. They're on different sides, even though they continue to say that they are the true MAGA, even when on questions like Israel or Iran or mergers and acquisitions or the place of trade policy in an overall growth mix. They are isolated. They don't represent his views.
Well, I think it was a similar story in the first term, and that more often than not in the first term, the Kudlow, Laffer, Cohn, Mnuchin wing won out. And not that there were a perfect monolith, but that there was, on the Venn diagram, a lot more overlap of that versus the Bannon-Navarro side and the MAGA populist. I think that a lot of us, I suspect many of you were with this, started to fear that the window had shifted a bit in the second administration, that the MAGA wing had more voice, more presence on one shoulder versus the other, as opposed to. I'm with you, Matt, that my read on it, at least economically, and I think you guys do the best at pointing out where this is true in foreign policy as well, the marginalization of Tucker and Tulsi and frankly, Vice President Vance in foreign policy has been a sight to behold. But I think on the economic side, I don't think that we're at 100-0. I don't think Reagan incarnate is back in the Oval. But I think that the supply sider in Trump is winning over the MAGA in Trump. And I'd put it at about 60-40.
This gives us an interesting transition because of as Matt alluded to, the MAGA response to other issues, including Israel. And we are hearing that people like Steve Bannon and Matt Gaetz, who is now on, I don't know, one of those weird non-Fox right-wing networks whose name I can't even remember, are saying, well, you know what? It's all over for Israel because young Republicans and MAGAites don't like Israel anymore, and they're not buying into this. And Marjorie Taylor Greene called Israel's actions a genocide this week in an attack on Randy Fine, the freshman from Florida. And then there's a terrible Gallup poll out that says that young people in America are turning, against Israel. However, I do want to point out, and so there is this fight, and what I think is interesting about the fight is that young MAGA Republicans are falling for leftist, anti-American argumentation on TikTok and the same media that young people are consuming all over the place, that is distorted, that is deliberately distorted, and is, has been systematically being pumped to them through the algorithms to push them toward this idea that Israel's behavior is, uniquely awful and monstrous as it attempts to defend itself against this seven-front war that Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah have been conducting against it since October 7th. Two good points about this to be made are that despite all of this talk, according to Gallup, 71% of Republicans support Israel. So that's not 90%, but it is 7 out of 10. Maybe the 29% that don't support are this Bannon wing, or maybe it's just you're never going to get much higher support for any individual issue in any party except maybe nominal support for Trump, than 70%. So I think that's reassuring to those of us who are supporters of Israel. But it is important to note that at some point, and this is where we have to get to what the New York Times has done over the last couple of days, they're being patsies. MAGA is becoming a patsy of the New York Times and a patsy of Chinese-owned TikTok and a patsy of Gutter by buying into these arguments. And Seth, maybe you can give us a hand here on what the New York Times has been up to. We talked about it on Monday, this incredible story that said two Israeli officials who are unnamed claimed that Hamas is not stealing aid. And so for the last 4 days, people have just been running, images of Hamas jumping on the trucks and stealing aid from, the minute the aid started flowing across the Kerem Shalom crossing and all of that. But what's going on?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to refer back to something you said earlier, I want to be very clear with the left on something. The Marjorie Taylor Greene for Richie Torres trade, no backsies. Enjoy. She's yours. And I hope you guys are very happy together. Yeah, I mean, look, the New York Times has a very particular way, not just the New York Times, but of course the New York Times itself has been at the center of this. But the New York Times has a very particular way of wording things. And you have to understand how to read the news, right? And the NGOs and the so-called humanitarian organizations, they use this terminology too. And so the New York Times or the UN or one of the agencies at the UN will say, we have no proof that Hamas is stealing the majority of the aid. And that's what they'll say. Here's what's happening. We know Hamas is stealing some of the aid outright, right? As you said, John, we watch videos of them doing it. But the larger point is that Hamas has hundreds of tons of flour and the people in Gaza don't. So how you classify how that food got from the truck to the Hamas warehouse or whatever is far less important than the point, which is this. Hamas has set up a system in which the food comes through them. So they guide the trucks and they are paid by the UN to be the security for the trucks, and they are given a certain cut of the humanitarian aid that comes in. Second, they are asked to guard warehouses and stockhouses of food for the UN. So they control the food that way. So you could say, well, they didn't steal the food. The UN is giving Hamas the food instead of giving it to the Palestinian starving civilians. You see, it's fine. So that's essentially, you have to understand, that's essentially what the New York Times and these UN agencies are saying. They're saying they're playing word games. Now, what the New York Times did.
Can I add another word game, Seth? That I think
sure.
You pointed this out too, which is you mentioned in a great post yesterday about the armed gangs. So whenever you see the trucks go over and then they're being swarmed, and the media says, well, the armed gangs stole the food, but
right.
Couldn't those armed gangs be Hamas, right? I mean, isn't that just, who's to say?
A distinction without a difference.
It's a total distinction without a difference.
Yeah.
Hamas is a pretty big armed gang.
Yeah, and not just that, but Hamas, look, after October 7th, every single terrorist group and offshoot in Gaza pledged allegiance to Hamas and pledged allegiance to the war publicly, PFLP and all these other ones. Right. They're operating as one thing under the direction of Hamas. That's really all you have to know about anybody with a gun, pretty much anybody with a gun. Now, what the New York Times has done is interesting because the Times was only one of a great many news agencies, let's say, that ran a photo of a malnourished looking child and being held in his mother's arms in Gaza. And the photo was deemed so powerful that it was, last week's wow, what a photo, on Twitter. This is like 7,000 people that in your timeline go, wow, what a photo. And it turned out that the boy,
by the way, it took up not that anybody sees the live paper anymore, except Matt Continetti, who still reads physical media. But it was
The
a
front page.
third of the page. No, it wasn't just the
Huge.
front page.
Yeah.
It took
And
up
as
6
and as readers
inches.
of the print media,
Yeah.
Matt, as Matt could tell you, I believe the tagline on the print on the front page said straight out, the boy's mother said he was born healthy. Right, that was in the print, so you can't even take print back. But anyway, the point is that the boy has congenital diseases. He has muscular diseases. He has all sorts of. It's a terrible situation. He has all sorts of pre-existing health problems that contribute to the way that he looks and processes food and is able to move his muscles and is able to develop, his musculature and all the other stuff. He has in the main picture that you saw, what's cropped out is his healthy, I think, 3-year-old brother, who's standing right there and is obviously well fed. So this is one of the important parts of the photo, right? Because people say you can't compare. Why haven't I seen starving adults? And then people say, well, adults process malnutrition differently than young children, especially babies, because they have to thrive. They're on different kinds of charts. They process the blah, 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 blah. Okay. But the 18-month-old and the 3-year-old, all else being equal, process the food the same way and grow the same way and are on the same growth chart.
So that's something that should have been obvious to people, but that's not the most important aspect of this as we speak today. What's important is that the New York Times was compelled to acknowledge that it had run a photo in error, or that the photo gave an erroneous impression of the specific scene that it was depicting. And two interesting things about that, because we should read aloud their description. But it is important to note, New York Times has put this out on X or Twitter. It has various feeds. There are various feeds, NY Times feeds. One of those feeds has 50 million followers. And another one, which has some other name, has 80,000 followers. And when they put out what Seth is about to read, they put it out on the feed that has 80,000 followers and not on the feed that has 50 million followers. So having disseminated this photo, that I think more than any other individual image flipped the script on how Israel is now just blatantly
and by the way,
deliberately starving children.
Probably got Trump to say his comments in Scotland on Monday.
Yeah, when he said, you can see they're starving.
Clearly Trump saw the photo. Trump also reads print media. So he clearly saw it and was like, this is not good. We need to change this.
Right.
So mission accomplished, New York Times.
Yeah.
So here's the text. I'll just read the text of the. Well, first of all, the tweet. It's on New York Times PR, not the main New York Times account, as John said. The tweet says, "We have appended an editor's note to a story about Mohammed Zakaria al-Mutawak, a child in Gaza who was diagnosed with severe malnutrition. After publication, the Times learned that he also had pre-existing health problems. Read more below." And so here's the statement from a spokesperson from the New York Times. "Children in Gaza are malnourished and starving, as New York Times reporters and others have documented. We recently ran a story about Gaza's most vulnerable civilians, including Mohammed Zakaria al-Mutawak, who is about 18 months old and suffers from severe malnutrition. We have since learned new information, including from the hospital that treated him and his medical records, and have updated our story to add context about his pre-existing health problems. This additional detail gives readers a greater understanding of his situation. Our reporters and photographers continue to report from Gaza bravely, sensitively, and at personal risk, so that readers can see firsthand the consequences of the war."
Okay, that's what they wrote. That's what they put out. 7 hours earlier, Amit Segal, our friend, who is a commentator in Israel, has this great newsletter called It's Noon in Israel, AMITSEGAL. People keep asking me how to spell his name and find it. It's called It's Noon in Israel. Type his name into Google and you can subscribe to his newsletter. Wrote a piece that said about how the New York Times was trying to prop up Hamas. And at 10 a.m. yesterday, New York Times PR put the following out in response. They appended it to an Amit Segal post and put this out. The Times reporting is based on interviews with Israeli military officials, among others, and a review of records and sources involved with Gaza aid distribution. As our piece makes clear, the Israeli military has not disputed our findings. Times journalists have done deep reporting on Benjamin Netanyahu's actions and tactics during the war, and we will continue to publish the truth regardless of attacks and distractions. And then 7 hours later, they apologized for running the photo without an apology. So in the morning, they're getting all huffy and self-righteous about the horrible injustice Amit Segal was expressing by saying that the Times was trying to prop up Hamas. And then hours later, they actually said the opposite. They said, yes, we actually ran this photo that showed something that we did not claim, that has been proven to be untrue. And let me just add to this, as our friend Ira Stoll reminds us, he put out a piece on June 9th, 2025, about a Saturday, May 31st edition of the New York Times with another haunting front page photograph. Guess of what? A skeletal child with the cut line, "Hunger tightens its grip on Gaza." Sound familiar? This is May, not July. This is 2 months ago. And the further text, "Aid began to trickle into the territory last week, but there is never enough. Above a girl, 6 in Gaza City in the Strip's north. Skeletal and terrible." Okay, this girl, her name is Najwa Hussein Hajjaj. The needs specially prepared meals because of an esophagus condition. And Israel, together with Jordan, had her removed from Gaza to Italy, where she is now in a hospital getting treatment. So, this is the second time in 2 months that they have run a false photo of a starving child who is someone with congenital health issues.
John, can I say a few things here?
Excuse me?
I just want to say a few things here about this.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
First of all, in the New York Times correction, or whatever, the
announcement.
The announcement, yeah. They don't give a diagnosis, right? They say the child has pre-existing conditions. What is this poor kid suffering from? I have a feeling they don't give a diagnosis because it would tell the entire story, okay? Pre-existing conditions can mean, that could be, anything can be exacerbated.
You won't get covered by insurance. When you use the term pre-existing condition in America, right. It's like, oh no, now I'm going to have to fight with my health insurance company to get covered.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say is that you can go back much farther than 2 months. You can go back a year and see this stuff. And from what I can tell, there is not one legitimate photo of documenting starvation in Gaza. And here's the thing about that. What would the New York Times, NPR, all these outlets want more than anything in the world? A single, undisputable piece of evidence showing a starving Gazan. And there has not been one. It's astounding.
Bernard, the photographer is there in Gaza.
Yeah.
And he's asking the families, show me a starving child.
We're here
and
to tell the story.
And the only picture he came away with was a child who is not in that condition because of malnutrition.
It gets back to this deficit, this asymmetry. The only sources we have for what's happening in Gaza are the Gaza Health Ministry, Hamas, the journalists who operate under Hamas's supervision and, next to the men with the armed gangs with the machine guns, and the United Nations. And it's the United Nations that just yesterday came out with the latest thing, proclaiming a famine and saying that people are dying of hunger. But these are just assertions. There's no. Meanwhile, the food is going in. Israel's letting the food back in.
Also, by the way, when we point out on social media or in writing or elsewhere that this photo is actually of a child with a genetic condition. This photo is a child with a muscular condition. The response is, "Oh, that's so much better. Israel is just depriving treatment to sick kids instead of starving them." No, no, no. First of all, no one is alleged depriving treatment. They're telling a story that's not true. They're making an allegation
right.
about starvation.
So we're in Tawana Brawley territory
Right.
here, right? Tawana Brawley claimed that she was raped in the streets of Poughkeepsie, New York, and in 1988 or something like that. It turned out that she was in a fight with her stepfather who had beaten her up or something like that. And a year of coverage of this and the horrible, cops raping her, the mistreatment of young black teenage girls in evil racist precincts. And then when it came out that it was a hoax, the initial response to it was, well, it's fake but accurate. That what was being revealed here was a truth. Maybe this one story was wrong, but surely there are cops all over Dutchess County who are raping black teenage girls. That once you get caught, you say, well, but what we were showing there was a representation of a deeper truth. And I just wanted to point out that Bernard-Henri Lévy took a trip to Sudan, came back, and here is what he tweeted. Just returned from Sudan. 150,000 dead, 12 million displaced, a famine confirmed by all NGOs, and no one to care, no one to mobilize, almost no one to speak of the horror. So, right now, 1,200 miles south of Gaza, there is an actual deliberately engineered man-made famine caused by a war that is going on. Nobody cares. There are no reporters there. No one cares because there are no Jews involved. There are no Jews involved. There's no blood libel to be propounded, and that's where we are right now.
I know we have to go, but we should just mention one other piece of news, which was that yesterday the Arab League, for the first time, called on Hamas to disarm and to leave Gaza. And the aforementioned Amit Segal suggests that this may be a kind of a trial balloon signaling things happening beneath the surface. And we also have the news this morning that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's diplomat numero uno, is on his way to Israel. So there could be some change in strategy, could be some major moves coming up soon.
Right. David Bahnsen, thank you so much for joining us. Your insights are always original and welcome, and for a complete economic illiterate like me, very helpful. Because now once we get off here, I will completely forget everything that you said because I just can't. I won't forget everything you said. But once you start saying basis points, I don't know where to go with that. But that's me. That's my weakness. That's my problem. You're incredibly insightful and incredibly helpful, and I think everybody who listened today got a real understanding of the news today, which is very helpful, so that you don't fall for the GDP, the sort of the high, the sugar high of the GDP number, but look at this in a broader and greater way. And
or the doom and gloom of the last GDP number. It cuts both ways. And I appreciate your kind words. I always love being on with you. And I just want to say that if you ever want me to not say basis points and actually say 1/100% for every time the math has to come up.
That would be worse. I will admit that would be worse. So then basis point. because then you start getting into fractions, and then I'm like I'm in seventh grade again, and it's really bad. So
we don't even really say basis points in my world. We say bips. That's how dedicated we are to abbreviation and simplicity.
I like a good bip.
This is news.
Bip is better. Okay, I'm going with bip. Yeah. Okay. So thanks again, and for Matt, Seth, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.